And joining me is Economist and Political Analyst Dr. Vanus James from Tobago. Dr. James, the Tobago budget presentation is out, of course, and you have some strong opinions, which I like, and it's interesting, some of the things that you're pointing out that was not in the budget, that the public might be missing for those who have a similarly discerning eye, such as yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm a professional economist, and my entire profession was spent trying to understand what we have to do to lift the people of Tobago into a land of freedom. So budgets cannot confluff me. And when I look at this budget that this government has put forward here, I'm troubled, to say the least.
Well, so, I mean, I'm reading some of the analysis that you actually provided me this morning here from the budget. And one of the major things that you pointed out, as well as talking to you off air, is the fact that the Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance did not necessarily speak to the decline in the economy and some of the issues that might be derived from that. It doesn't seem to be a part, or at least he didn't speak to that with regards to how his plan, the budget, will seek to address that.
Well, let me be frank and straightforward. When we removed the PNM from office, we removed the PNM because of its awful economic performance, along with its terrible governance model and practice. So if in 2022, the Chief Secretary is presenting a budget after a year of his own tenure, 18 months after his own tenure, and he is telling the Tobagonian community about the state of the Tobago economy, it is the responsible thing to do to contrast it with the state of the economy in 2021, when the PNM was running the thing. In 2021, we had an economy that was in trouble. At the end of the year, we moved the PNM. In 2022, when the Chief Secretary is presenting the statement about the Tobago economy, he says to us, GDP in Tobago was 1.65 billion. And then he moves on to a whole lot of fancy footworks. But the fact is that the Chief Secretary knew that the output of Tobago fell by 2% in 2022, below that of 2021. So why do you hide that from the people of Tobago? Why is that not critical to guiding the way you are budgeting? And not only that, let's be clear, the content of the decline is also significant. Government stone out fell by 7%. Now, government is 46% of the Tobago economy from the output side, and it employs 64% of our paid employees. So if that is in decline by 7%, what do you think that will mean for the people of Tobago? Agriculture fell by 9.5%. That's 1%. Okay, that's not as big as government, but poor people will feel it. Construction and quarrying fell by 35%. This is after a year of the THA and Farley fighting with the construction sector, right? And it's not just the build component of it, the quarrying component fell at the same. So after a year of fighting with them, you have a sector now that is in major crisis. That's 4%, 3.4% of our economy. And there are serious people who are working in that sector who will feel the pain, get laid off and stuff like that. Now, the financial sector, this is a huge thing.
Yes.
And real estate fell by 5.1%. This is 27% of the Tobago economy. And this is important because when the economy is in trouble, you have to be looking to the financial sector to provide credit to investors who want to take steps to generate recovery. If the financial sector is in decline, you have to say something in the budget properly about what we have to do to deal with that for the private sector to grow. Finance fell by 5.1%. Why isn't that drawn to the attention of the people of Tobago when you're budgeting for us? So I am very worried about whether this presentation was intended to hoodwink rather than to clarify for people what we're trying to achieve. Do you follow my point?
Yes, but I do want to ask, first of all, you're saying 2%, right? A reduction. Now,
this is by the THA's own data.
Now, some people might say, well, 2% might not be that bad. So I don't know if there's a way you could quickly kind of put it in perspective. Just what does a 2% reduction mean during a time period where the rest of the Caribbean who suffer through COVID, who don't necessarily have oil and gas reserves, granted, we have a complex situation, but the tourist islands of the Caribbean, they were able to experience growth, I believe, in the same period. So what does a 2% reduction mean overall? Because it looks like a small number.
I'll give you the exact meaning when you look in terms of the earnings people generate. The CSO provided me last the data on earnings in the Tobago economy. Earnings, when the economy declines, it means wages are going to fall, profits are going to fall, taxes are going to fall, indirect taxes and direct taxes, and so on. So an important piece of evidence that tells you what it means in practical terms for real people is that in Tobago in 2022, real earnings fell by 6.1%. That's wage earnings and so on. And it's distributed unevenly across the population, as you might know. The richer people experience a slower decline. Poor people's income fell by 8.5%. That's people who are in the bottom half of the income distribution. Middle income people in the middle tiers of the income distribution, their income, their earnings fell by 7.7%. So the 2% decline at the level of the economy as a whole is translated into decline in other parts of the economy. And here in the case of earnings, what you're seeing is a major hit in households. So when people are grumbling about Farley's videotape and all that grumbling and disappointment that people are expressing reflects the fact that they're feeling these pains in their pockets, and they have to find a way to tell you about it. If you look in the US and you look in Britain and so on, the government's reputation takes a hit when this is happening, right? Farley's rate, Biden's rating is in the 40s because there is a fall in real income in the US.
Well,
so Tobagonians are no different. They're going to express it in terms of anger with the government.
Well, now Tobago has a situation that is a bit unique in that it's a budget allocation, at least with regards to the THA's available finances. A lot of it comes allocated from central government, of which technically they got a similar amount to what the previous PNM administration got, but not what Farley Augustine was asking for. To what extent is that a factor with regards to the economic performance? Was Trinidad's interference in any way, did it have a part to play, do you think?
I don't think so. I think this is entirely our own doing here. Let me tell you what you have to pay attention to. If I am the economist reporting the 1.65 billion, one of the things I'll keep an eye on for the country, because the budget of Tobago is not just from the national, it's primarily from the Trinidad. Don't forget that. And you have to look at how the budget performs by itself. The way you look at that, and you compare with Tobago, and you compare Tobago with Trinidad, here's what you look at. We spent 2.4 billion, roughly, in 2022 to produce 1.65 billion. So really what you're doing is you're operating at a loss. The government of Trinidad and Tobago spent, say, 65 billion. Say 60 billion. That produced 1 150 billion, right? So that's near 3 times the value of the budget in Trinidad and Tobago. It's produced by the economy, and the government, if it's wise, could interpret that as success. In Tobago, this is a demonstration of failure. Our economy, with the same money that the PNM got in 2021, produces less. Now remember, we removed the PNM because we thought it was poor performance. So fancy footworks should not be used to hide the fact that we have underperformed in 2022 and need to do serious things, develop a major investment program to turn this around. When you look at this budget, you don't see any sign of it. And let me tell you, the economic performance rests on particular pieces of data that Farley ought to have brought to the people of Tobago to explain why he has the budget in a certain way. The jobs in Tobago are mainly elementary jobs. 32% of the jobs in Tobago are elementary occupations. That's messenger, cleaner, and all of that sort of stuff. In Trinidad, that's only 18%. In Trinidad, 18% of the jobs. So you have a problem there. You have to deal with that if you are Tobago. You have to put in a program to create new, better jobs. This is no time to be dealing in political fancy footworks. 62% of the workers in Tobago essentially had no education, at best secondary schooling without passing any subject. That's what you're talking about. 62%. You have to lay out a proper program to deal with that specific type of fact in order to turn this kind of economy around. And let me tell you, the country ought to know, 81% of Tobago is spare labor. 81%, and no better than primary education. So you have to put programs in place to fix those kinds of solve in order that you could get better economic performance. And it is the responsibility of the government not to play politics, but to lay out the facts before the people of Tobago and adduce from those facts the programs that will allow us to move our economy forward and not live in continuous dependence on Port of Spain. This is a state of crisis in Tobago, and especially it's a major crisis for young. So we have to be transparent with them.
Now, the new budget is looking for 4.5 billion allocation, with reoccurring expenditure being 3.4 billion. And one of the things that you pointed out here is, what is the justification for that increase in reoccurring expenditure from 2 billion the year before to 3.4 billion planned, right? And I do have to ask, is this even realistic? Is there any bad signs? Why is it with reoccurring expenditure just not necessarily doubling, but increasing by over 50% in the space of year to year?
Exactly. That's the kind of question that you have. That's what you have to explain to the public if you're budgeting. First of all, you were making do on consumption with 2 billion last. 2 billion. Now you find a way to say to the public, I want 3.4 billion. You've got to explain that. You've got to explain what is it about the level of consumption in Tobago and recurrent consumption at that you want to deal with, that makes it necessary for us to spend $3.4 billion next year. Is it that you are starting a whole series of investment programs which will have recurrent components that must be added to the budget? And if so, then you have to be very clear about what those investment programs would be. But it doesn't make sense in terms of investment, because all you are proposing for your investment program is 1.15 billion. 1.15 billion cannot have recurrent spending components that will be added to the tune of somewhere near 1.4 billion. Mm-hmm. It cannot make any sense. You cannot have the recurrent component of the investment budget bigger than the investment budget itself. It doesn't make any sense. So Farley has to explain to the public, not to a public that he thinks is gullible, but he must remember we're not gullible here in Tobago. You have to explain to the public what this means, it does not make financial and economic sense. And then you have to justify it from another standpoint. You have 1.15 billion for investment and 3.4 billion for recurrent spending. How does that make sense of our economy in the kind of crisis I just described? The economy is in crisis. Clearly, you have to invest big and more than the recurrent spending in order to move this economy. So it makes no sense to spend $3.4 billion on consumption and 1.5 billion on investment when you have a major economic crisis on your hand. And in particular, when a big part of that crisis is the private sector that is underperforming relative to government.
Well, and that point right there, it seems as though development spending, the THA's executive has more or less said that repeatedly. Tobago is in need for development. Tobago is in need of development. In fact, Farley even had a statement before he spoke about the amount of budget allocation he was asking for, where he said, well, look, I understand that some economists don't see the need to start with development spending, even though we don't necessarily have the plans in place. So he's talking about development, but he's also talking about the fact that it seems as though they don't have everything, all of their T's crossed and I's dotted and their plans cemented with regards to long-term what they're going to do. He wants to start the ball rolling, even though, you know, the initial stages aren't finished yet. Are you concerned that perhaps, well, I'm sure you're disappointed with the budget, but long term now, is this like a bad sign that the developmental requirements of Tobago will be set behind, not just necessarily with regards to the performance of the economy from 2022 to 2023, but how now the money is going to be spent this year will potentially be so ineffective that you're not necessarily going to meet the gains that the island requires?
I mean, the evidence from last year is that this is a government that clearly doesn't know what it is doing, right? You just made the point that all over the Eastern Caribbean, we're seeing growth.
Yes.
Okay, I am working in the Eastern Caribbean now, so I could tell you you're right, and they're not happy with what they're getting. But you have a situation in Tobago where output is falling, and the government is telling us that the best way to budget our funds is to spend more on consumption, which will not grow output. Tobago is in need of investment spending to grow productive capacity. And we're spending 1.15 billion on investment spend and 3.34 on consumption spending. Where is the growth going to come from? What are the growth channels that the consumption spending will activate? The answer to that fundamentally is none. And what this demonstrates is that the chief secretary cannot guide the people in the division of finance to plan properly. And the division of finance really is demonstrating its own inadequacy when it sets up and hands your chief secretary a budget like this to go out there and look bad. So it seems this is just a broad-based demonstration of lack of adequate leadership in the government. The chief secretary is the secretary of everything. You must understand how all the economy works. You must be able to guide the public servants. When Tracy could not guide the public servants properly, we didn't give Tracy a blight. We moved her from office. And this chief secretary is demonstrating the same kind of it. And it would lead ultimately to the people of Tobago removing him from office if this kind of behavior goes on like this. The expectation from this budget that I see is that the losses from last year will go on into next year. The losses from 2022 will go on into 2023, and so on, if they don't change their behavior.
Well, my final question, because I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I have to ask, because this is not the first time you have expressed those sentiments, and I was wondering, because as you said, you all voted out the PNM because you didn't like the job they were doing, right? And now we've reached a point where it seems as though this current administration is operating at a similar level. So is
And
there,
worse.
or worse, is there an alternative? Because it doesn't seem as though you yourself personally are advocating to go back to the PNM. Is there an alternative, or is it that Tobago needs to now somehow create, as soon as possible, a new alternative?
I think so. I think you have to build something different. You have to, when you're in a state of crisis like Tobago is, you have to discern what your problem is and take action. It is clear that the approach of the PNM creates nothing but bad for Tobago. The approach here and the approach in China. And it is clear for us now, after 18 months of failure, that this is an incompetent bunch that has no clue about where it is going. Now, if you are Tobago and you're faced with that, then you have to sit down and ask yourself, what do we do to find a set of people and the system of government? Because a big part of this problem is the system of government that allows an incompetent government to function, because the legislators cannot control the executive council. So you've got to and get the public involved in the governance process. So you've got to change the system and remove Farley from office and in the process encourage other people to come who are prepared to allow democracy to work so that we can all come together and build a viable economy here. I mean, it's long past time for Tobagonians to start paying their fair share of their way forward. We cannot continue to contribute 20% of the spending by a government that then just spends willingly and produces no serious results year on year on year that moves the Tobago economy towards greater development. That is unacceptable. That is a prescription for slavery.
Well, Dr. James, I don't want to keep you more than we promised you, but I want to thank you very much for the commentary, because I do believe I share some of your concerns with regards to the lack of development and the fact that the missed opportunities time and again, it's not enough to look back with regret when we see the results, and trying to have to dig ourselves out of it is not going to be an easy task.
Right, yeah. That's development, that's work. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Dr. James.
You're welcome.